In this lens review today, we're going to be talking about Canon's new ultra wide angle zoom lens, the Canon RF 15 to 35mm f2.8L IS USM. And I'm going to start right now. Back when Canon released their new RF mount in 2018, they actually released a whole bunch of prime and zoom lenses all at once. And this is one of them, the new Canon RF 15 to 35mm. So is it worth a spot in your camera bag? Today, let's find out in this in-depth lens review. So let's start off talking about build quality. Now, I actually really like the new RF lens design. They're a lot more simple and a lot more minimalist than the older EF version. So it is missing a few features that you would expect, like for instance, a focus window or full-time manual focus, but I actually really like the design of these lenses. Now, at the bottom, you've got a fairly decently sized zoom ring. Then you've got the focus ring, which isn't full-time manual focus, which is a little bit annoying. Then you've got your control ring. Now, control rings are found on all RF lenses. This one is clickable, and it lets you change certain aspects of what the camera can do, like shutter speed, aperture, ISO. I've actually got mine connected to white balance, and all you need to do is simply customize it with inside your camera. Now, on the side of the lens, you've also got two switches. You've got an autofocus to manual focus switch, as well as an image stabilization switch. So you can switch it off and switch it on with inside the lens, which I think is a really nice design. Now, it's made of 16 elements in 12 groups, and they're fairly evenly distributed throughout the lens, so it isn't too front heavy. I find a lot of Canon ultra wide angle zoom lenses, aka the 11 to 24mm, are incredibly front heavy, but this one doesn't seem to suffer from that. So if you want to use it for video as well as photography, you definitely can place this on a gimbal. Now, this lens is also weather sealed, but it is externally zoomed. Unlike the EF version, the 16 to 35mm f2.8, which was internally zoomed, this one, when it's from 35 to 15mm, it does get a little bit longer. Now, it does not going to majorly change the weight distribution of the lens, but it will mean dust and moisture can get in between that kind of grip that you can see here. So if I zoom from 35mm to 15mm, there's a small kind of hole that appears, and dust and moisture could definitely get in there. So although Canon are saying it's weather sealed, over time, you might notice it gets a little bit gritty. Like if you ever go to the beach, I can imagine easily sand can get in between that small hole there. So I'm not majorly happy with it being externally zoomed, but overall, I don't think it's a majorly bad point. And I don't think a lot of people ever really even run into that problem. So overall, I think this is a solid 9 out of 10. Right, so let's move on to the all-important image quality. Now, most ultra-wide-angle zoom lenses will suffer from mainly two problems: distortion and also vignetting. Distortion is that kind of barrel distortion or pincushion distortion you can sometimes see, and then also the vignetting is the kind of darker edges that you can sometimes appear in some images. So let's see how well this new RF lens fares up by looking at a few sample images. So I went ahead and took this lens to London. I went to a few rooftop gardens as well. I did a little bit of street and a little bit of architecture photography. And I must say, really like this lens. Walking around, it felt nice and comfortable. It wasn't too heavy, wasn't too big. It's quite a big lens, and it is a little bit heavier than other ultra wide angle zoom lenses. But to be honest with you, walking around, you don't really feel it, especially when you couple it with any of the R5 or R6. They're kind of nice cameras. Now, the resolution you get out of it is really nice. The corners are a little bit soft, and I do notice they're a little bit darker, but profile corrections when you turn them on in camera seems to really sort that problem out. All of these photos that you were looking at are shot in RAW. So I must say, for kind of the type of photography that I usually do with these lens reviews, I must say I was really happy with the sample images. But let's go and have a look at a few graph images. So let's firstly look at 15mm wide open at f2.8. Now, if we go ahead and look at the center is really nice and razor sharp, but the corners are definitely darker and they're definitely softer. So that vignetting really is starting to take shape. You can really see it wide open at f2.8. So if we go ahead and step down to f4, the corners definitely get a little bit brighter as well as a little bit sharper. So if you're using this lens wide open with no profile corrections, you will notice definitely darker and softer corners. Now, if we step down to f5.6, gets a little bit better, and it's the same with f8. I would actually say this lens performed optically perfect at f8. So if you wanted to shoot any landscape photography, f8 is definitely the aperture you want to use. But anything beyond that, diffraction definitely starts to take shape. So you can see that getting a little bit softer at f11 and then also at f16. Now, if we go ahead and zoom into 35mm, you can see that the lens is a little bit better. So the corners are a little bit sharper and they're not as dark as at 15mm. Then if you go ahead and step down to f4, again, a little bit better. And then again, f5.6 and then all the way to f8. So again, if you want to use this lens and get the sharpest images possible, I recommend shooting around f8. And then again, anything beyond that, diffraction does start to take shape a little bit, but I don't think it does perform a little bit better than what it was at 15mm. Right, so let's go and have a look at distortion and vignetting. So all of these images we're looking at today, profile corrections were turned off. Now if you go and have a look, wide open, 15mm at f2.8, crazy amount of barrel distortion as well as vignetting. Now something I'd usually expect is the vignetting to disappear at higher apertures like f4, 5.6 at f8. But with this lens here, that vignetting is here to stay. It gets reduced at f4 and at f5.6 and even at f8, but it is still there in the corners, so not a great sign. So if we go ahead and zoom into 35mm, that barrel distortion has flipped into pincushion distortion, which is really odd. And then you can still see that vignetting. So 2.8, then we step down to f4, that vignetting has been reduced, but it is still there, and at f5.6 and f8. So if you want to use this lens to get the best result, highly recommend shooting with profile corrections turned on. So overall, I think this lens performed really well when it comes to its overall image quality. The only real downside I found was that distortion and vignetting. The vignetting never really seemed to disappear and that distortion is quite bad, but once you turn profile corrections on, all of that pretty much gets sorted out. The corners do suffer a little bit with that softness, but to be honest with you, I think this lens is really sharp for what you get. And all of the photos you saw today, including the sample graph images, were all shot on my Canon EOS R5, which is a 45 megapixel camera. So yeah, really good lens, I think, when it comes to image quality. So overall, I'm going to be giving it another 9 out of 10. So let's quickly move on to size and weight. Now, this is one of the biggest RF ultra wide angle zoom lenses currently on the market. The only other one we can realistically compare it to is the RF 14 to 35mm. But let's go ahead and compare it to a few EF lenses as well. So the EF 16 to 35mm f4, as well as the 16 to 35mm f2.8. Now, if you take a look at this graph here, you can see that it is the largest on my list today, as well as also the heaviest, coming in at a whopping 840 grams. Where if we compare it to the RF 14 to 35mm, that comes in at way smaller, 540 grams. Then if we compare it to the EF 16 to 35mm, that comes in at 790 grams. Then at the 16 to 35mm f4, 615 grams. So, you know, if you're a travel photographer and size and weight is an issue, that 14 to 35mm is definitely interesting, far lighter. But if an aperture is important, so that f2.8, which to be honest, I do prefer an f2.8 aperture over an f4, then you're just gonna have to deal with that slightly heavier size and weight. To be honest with you, it's not massive, but compared to the other lenses today, it definitely is larger. So because of that, I'm going to be giving it a 5 out of 10. So let's move on to focus motor and image stabilization and what this lens is like for video. Again, everyone's starting to be a little bit more hybrid now, doing photo and video, so it's important for a lens that can do both. Now the autofocus, as you can imagine, brilliant. Really fast, really quick, and really precise. No issues there, to be honest with you. Pretty much all RF lenses perform really well, and this is just another one, really good, really fast, can't really complain. The image stabilization as well is really good. So in body, you're getting up to 5 stops of image stabilization. But if you couple it with the R5, R3, or any other kind of camera with image stabilization built in, so IBIS, it has up to 8 stops of image stabilization, which means you can pretty much shoot up to a second handheld, which is really impressive. So for video, that's going to offer a nice smooth motion. And for photography, you can shoot really long shutter speeds and create quite interesting effects with this lens. So I think this is a really good performer. Autofocus was really good and image stabilization was really good as well, especially if you've got an R5, an R3, maybe an R6 Mark II, any of those lenses with IBIS built in, this lens is going to perform beautifully with its image stabilization. So because of that, I'm going to give it the full marks, the 10 out of 10. And last but most importantly is price. Now annoyingly, currently all RF lenses I think are overpriced and this lens is no exception, coming in at a whopping £2,389. And the other RF lens we're talking about today is the 14 to 35mm f4 IS. And that still comes in at a whopping £1,749. So if you can find either of these two lenses secondhand, I highly recommend it because these prices, yeah, you know, these are good lenses, but are they worth over £2,000? I'm not sure. So let's compare it to some of the EF lenses. So if you compare it to the EF 16 to 35mm f2.8, brand new, that still comes in a whopping £2,199. But obviously, because this lens is far older, you will be able to find this lens secondhand almost everywhere, which is nice. You know, you can easily, if you find a good deal, you can be able to find it for about £1,500, which is definitely a good deal for a lens of that quality. And then if we go ahead and compare it to the EF 16 to 35mm f4 IS, a lens I have actually reviewed on this channel, which I really like, then that lens at brand new comes in at £1,389. And if you look secondhand, you'll be able to get it under sub £1,000, which is really nice. So if you're on more of a budget, either of those EF lenses, make sure you need to buy the adapter as well, will work with any of the mirrorless cameras. But if you can find any of the RF lenses secondhand, highly recommend it, because those brand new prices are astronomical. So because of that, I'm only going to be giving this lens a 6 out of 10. So it's that time of the video where we look at the pros and cons to really work out, is this 15 to 35mm f2.8 worth a spot in your camera bag? So the first pro is definitely image quality. I love the images, razor sharp images. The corners aren't the best, but you're still getting overall great image quality. I love that you get f2.8 as well as image stabilization built in. Previously, you only could choose between f2.8 with no IS or f4 with IS, and I love that you get both benefits. I also really like the build quality, really well made, and I can say that with all RF lenses. And lastly, I think this lens is great as a hybrid lens, so when you want to use it for photography as well as video. If you know, dabble in the two, this lens is the one for you. Right, so let's quickly look at the cons to see why maybe other lenses might be better off. Firstly, that distortion in vignetting, you just can't get away from it. You know, some lenses are better than others, and this lens definitely isn't one of the best when it comes to distortion and vignetting. This lens is also quite big and also quite heavy, so if you're a travel photographer, that 14 to 35mm is probably going to be better suited for you. And lastly, it is expensive, so if you can find it secondhand, highly recommend it. Otherwise, those EF lenses are definitely tempting. So as you can see, a decent amount of pros and a decent amount of cons. Overall, I would say the pros win because I love it's got f2.8 and image stabilization. It's just a shame how expensive this lens is. Brilliant, and there we go guys. So there is my lens review of the new RF 15 to 35mm f2.8. Now I thought it was a really good lens, great image quality. I love that it's got f2.8 aperture as well as image stabilization. Previously, you just couldn't get that. You had to choose between either f4 with IS or f2.8 without IS. So I love that the RF system is being able to bring both of those benefits together. The only real downside I could see is that distortion in vignetting and obviously the very high price point. But if you can get past the price, the distortion in vignetting can definitely be fixed in post. So I actually think it's a really good lens and definitely worth a spot in your camera bag if you're after a lens that can do both photography and also video. The image stabilization and the autofocus was really good for video. So if you're after a lens that realistically is great for video, highly recommend the 15 to 35mm. So let's go and have a look at the final results. So it scored 39 out of 50. So it's actually a recommended lens. The main thing that let it down was price point, but also size and weight. So if size and weight is an issue, that RF 14 to 35mm is definitely worth a spot in your camera bag. But if that's not a major problem, this lens here is definitely the one for you. I've been James for Photo Fever, and I'll catch you guys next time.